First up is Sean Carlson, who's worked extensively in logistics safety for over 15 years and is one of Australia's leading engineers in the field of road transport safety. He's joining us to discuss industrial traffic management, key risks and improvement opportunities in sight, and we'll have an opportunity, as I say, to ask him some questions after the presentation. So please send those questions through and I can see them on a giant screen over there and I'll be sure to ask him. Welcome to you, Sean.
Thank you very much, Ellen, and thank you for the opportunity to talk today about this critical safety risk. And it's really great to be amongst speakers of the calibre that we've had so far this morning. So I really appreciate the opportunity. So today I'm going to be going through some of the key considerations around traffic management for your sites, particularly around the site access space, and some of the critical areas that we need to understand a little bit more clearly in that little area there. So I guess from our point of view and the work that we do in this space, for us, we see this as a really significant risk for a lot of industrial sites. And the reason for that is that the penalty of failure here is really significant. We have the ability to make a really positive impact for people's lives. And if we fail to match up to the standard required, then we obviously have the ability to create a poor impact. So for us, this is something that we're really keen to progress and see done better. So today, I'm going to really cover off three kind of key areas. The first is around some key risks around the interaction risk between pedestrians, vehicles, and mobile plant, and what the mechanisms of those risks and some of the latent conditions that sit behind some of these areas when we're looking at assessing them. I'm going to go through some of the options to manage and improve some of those risks, and obviously it's a fairly compressed session today, so it'll be fairly high level, but there should be some key areas there that you're able to take away and implement and evaluate in your own sites, in your own businesses. And that implementation space is the last area that I'm going to cover off, particularly around some of the best practice approaches to how you take those improvement ideas and implement them in your sites. And certainly that management of change space is particularly important when we think about that aspect. So, if we look at some of the key mechanisms of risk that we're dealing with when we have mobile plant and heavy vehicles on our sites, one of the key areas that we have to manage is this issue of radial visibility. And what I mean by that is the visibility that the operator has of the activity around him or her when they're sitting in their machine. And that can be quite limited in many cases. And as the machine gets bigger, that radial visibility problem increases. It's quite easy for people to be outside of that 3 metre zone that is typically is very common as a risk management methodology in terms of that distance away from the plant, and still be invisible to the operator of that plant. There's a lot of components of the mobile plant that are sitting in front of the operator, whether it's pillars, whether it's the mast, or different hydraulic components that make it very easy to put a person in a zone where the operator can't see them. So you can see here for a typical, this is for a very small piece of plant, a typical 2.5 tonne counterbalance. It's very easy to put someone in a space. You can see on the left-hand side, a person with a high visibility vest is still invisible to the operator, even though they're well outside the 3 metre zone. So we have a latent condition with some of our mobile handling equipment that actually allows us to put people in a very high risk zone without us being aware that they're there. If we look at that in a heavy vehicle space, that problem is present as well. So we can quite easily have a situation where the driver of that vehicle has quite a significant blind spot and area of invisibility for people quite close to their vehicles. And we can still be outside of that 3 metre zone and still have a problem with visibility for our drivers. So these are the sorts of latent conditions that we need to understand are sitting out there in our site with that equipment, and we need to understand how we're going to improve our systems of separating our people and our plant and our heavy vehicles to make sure we're managing that fundamental condition that's sitting there right now. So if we look at some of the mechanisms of risk that are common on some of our industrial sites, what we see most commonly is fundamentally a lack of ownership of areas. If there's a clear designation of who is owning a particular area for that activity, then it makes it harder to have these risks start to transpire in your workplace. So some of these critical areas are particularly when we're doing loading, unloading activities, or if we've got mobile plant like the front end loader you can see in the bottom left there, with pedestrians in the same zone. So what we need to make sure is that we've gone and risk assessed these locations and these activities. Working with loading, unloading vehicles is a really common one. And working around a larger mobile plant like that front end loader is also a fairly common risk in the space of this interaction between pedestrians and mobile plant. So whilst a lot of these risks might be well understood, we need to make sure that we've got some really good systems in place to manage them and that we're giving the empowerment to the people to own those spaces. If we give them that empowerment, then that allows them to make sure that they're managing that area really tightly and taking ownership of what happens within that area. Another area that we see quite frequently with quite significant risk is this whole area of access and egress of the sites. Typically, there's a big over-reliance on the hazard perceptions of the pedestrians relative to the vehicles or the mobile plant. And this idea of common sense being the overriding risk mechanism, risk management tool, along with PPE, is really there's an over-reliance on that risk management strategy. So you can see here a whole bunch of situations where we've got people in proximity to heavy vehicles and mobile plant, and there's no real formal system to manage that interaction. So we're heavily reliant upon the hazard perception of the pedestrians to manage that risk, which is obviously not a very satisfactory space to be. If we come down then and look at what the fundamental principles are that we need to deploy to manage these risks, fundamentally we've got a couple of key steps we need to go through. And these key steps will be very familiar to anyone who's worked in a workplace health and safety environment going through a risk assessment process. So first of all, obviously we've got to identify our hazards and understand what they are and risk assess those hazards. That's a fairly straightforward process, and there's a lot of really good information around to support that activity. Once we've got to that space and we're starting to look at how we're going to implement systems to manage those risks, there's a real opportunity here to drag in the feedback from your employees and the people who work in these spaces every day to understand how what are the best solutions we can deploy in these areas and get their feedback and engagement in that process. As we get that feedback and engagement, we have the opportunity to actually improve the cultural change of that site and ultimately of the business to manage these risks better. And we know that if we're doing that well, after we've implemented, when we start getting more and more feedback coming back from the people on the site about additional risks that we might not have understood prior to going through this process. So our key goals here are really to maximise our separation between our mobile plant and our vehicles and our people, try and eliminate these shared spaces without any defined protocols. So how are we making sure that we've got clear ownership change and how do we make that clear and transparent to everyone using those areas? So the process of finding these solutions really is really mirrors the sort of Swiss cheese model. So we really want to make sure that we've maximised the number of different risk controls that are managing any given one issue. We don't want to be too reliant on one particular risk control to manage any given issue. So things like making sure we're challenging the pedestrian presence in critical areas. Is it really necessary to have people in these locations? What physical systems can we put in place to make sure people understand when the ownership of an area has changed? So when is this area a mobile plant area? When does it become a heavy vehicle area? And then again, it may even become a pedestrian area, but not concurrently. So we don't have a mix of those activities in the same place at the same time. Obviously, once we put those physical systems in place, we need to then make sure that we've trained people in how to use them and that they have the risk awareness for their activities in their areas. Obviously, that needs to be supported by safe, lots of reporting, because fundamentally what we're looking for here is to make sure people have the understanding of what they need to do when no one's around. So a couple of specific little cases here. Shared pathways are obviously a high risk at site entry and exits, and there's ways there you can see of managing those different locations and the relative risk of having people and heavy vehicles in those entry and exit points, particularly for pedestrian access and egress from the site. Another area that we see commonly as high risk is the access point between drivers and pedestrians and sort of high use parts of the site like administration buildings. So what we need to be doing here is making sure we're giving a lot of separation between these activities and time and space for the pedestrians and the vehicles to manage that potential interaction. The more space we can provide the heavy vehicle to actually minimise the risk of that interaction, the lower the risk of that interaction will be. So having that barrier type system is obviously important, and obviously challenging the need for people to make move along those pathways is also an important issue. Another common area, I guess, of the entry points and exit points is this interaction between light and heavy vehicles. Light and heavy vehicles don't mix well. Typically, there's a big difference between dynamics of light and heavy vehicles, and I know that this is something that's a fairly common risk that we understand on our roads, and it's no different really in terms of what happens on the site. So we need to try and maximise the space between those entry and exit points for light and heavy vehicles. Try and have a separate space for those vehicle types, so we try and separate out those flows wherever it's feasible. So in general terms, what we're looking to do here is go through a process of identifying our risks. So that is looking at the key areas where we're likely to have shared spaces, spaces where we have a mix of potential flow types. Once we understand those risks, then we need to go through the process of putting together risk controls. Those controls need to really challenge some of our existing practices. So what practices do we have where we have pedestrians in particular close to operational areas where there might be light and heavy vehicles operating? And how can we really push back on those activities to understand if they're absolutely critical? Quite often, one of the key aspects we see in some of the sites we evaluate is that the process of evaluating that pedestrian access probably hasn't been evaluated and challenged quite as well as it could have otherwise been. So it's really important to make sure that we're putting the effort into understanding how we can go through an elimination process before we start moving on to some of the softer controls around administration, PPE, putting barriers in and those sorts of things. Once we've identified that we've got the right solutions in place, then there's an opportunity to then work with our people in the site to implement those systems. And fundamentally, I think there's a really good opportunity here to set in place interim systems first. Don't spend a whole lot of time putting in permanent solutions as your first point. By putting in some interim solutions, we have a whole bunch of benefits that come from that. First of all, the people on site can see that there's an immediate impact from their input. They have the ability to see visually that the process we're going through is real and meaningful. And we're not taking 6 months to implement something. We can have something in place in a matter of days or weeks. So that the ability to put in these interim solutions really helps us with our change management process by making sure we can have that those systems put in place very quickly. And obviously it reduces our risk. Once those interim systems are in place, we've got the opportunity then to modify them quite easily. And it allows the people on site to have that visual input on how they get set up. So we can move these around very quickly. We can update those systems very quickly as well. And that increases the buy-in of those end systems once we decide that we're ready to implement and integrate those temporary interim solutions into a permanent space. So the that interim process and putting in some initial controls really helps us with our change management on the sites, with our teams on the ground to understand what does good look like for these solutions and what might we need to do to modify those systems a little bit before we go into a full-scale implementation. So that's the key outcomes here that we've been talking about today, is really around understanding where your risks are on this, these interactions between people and mobile plant. Really challenge the need to have people in those spaces. Once we've understood what our risks are and what our controls are, go through a really good process of management of change to put in those interim solutions and then into the implementation and integration of those systems into your workplace. So thanks very much, Ellen, for the opportunity to talk about this issue today, and obviously welcome any feedback or queries from the session.
Wonderful. You did that precisely on time with 1 second to spare. Absolutely fantastic. And thank you for that really forensic look. We've had some questions come up and they came up just as your presentation was about to answer them. That forensic look at where the risk is, what are the attitudes that underpin some of the terrible mistakes that happen, particularly with pedestrians, the passive perception of vehicles, and also that notion of don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. So we are out of time. Thank you very much, Sean. That was a really, really informative session. Appreciate your time. Sean Carlson.
Thank you.